Hello and welcome to IBTimes UK. Today we speak to Philip Cowley, a professor in parliamentary government from the University of Nottingham. He's the co-editor of Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box. So Philip, thanks for joining us today. I was just wondering what your main motivation was behind co-editing the book.
I think we had two motivations really. The first was that me and my co-editor and all the contributors find elections fascinating, and we're sort of aware that that's not a generally widely shared viewpoint out there. People think elections are boring, and the reason we think elections are interesting is because they're about people. They're about people who stand, people who vote for them, why they vote for them, and like everything involving people, you find out a lot about people from elections, and I think we wanted to get some of that across. The second reason, I think, was that there's a lot of academic research on elections. In Britain alone, there's 40 to 50 years worth of research, and we're often aware when we watch TV or watch the way elections are discussed that some of the nuances, some of the things we know about the way people vote are not coming across in that discussion. And so we wanted, again, to sort of let people know some of this research, get it out to a wider community.
So I've been dipping in and out of the book on the tube. It's very user-friendly. I just wondered, what's your favourite chapter of the book?
Probably my favourite, although I've lots of favourites, but if I had to pick one, it would be a chapter about people that give opinions on non-existent issues. And what this is trying to test is people who, when presented with an opinion poll question, even if there is no right answer, still feel the need to claim to have a viewpoint on it. And the way it does this is by asking voters about their views on non-existent policies, so the Monetary Control Act that doesn't exist, the Agricultural Trade Bill that doesn't exist, and finding out whether they'll just say, I don't know, or whether they'll still claim to have a view on it. And what it finds is that actually about 15% of people will have a view on completely non-existent policies. The bit that I really like, though, is the people who are particularly likely to have a view on this non-existent policy. The first is men. Men are 50% more likely to have views on policies that don't actually exist, which is one of the reasons they often score very highly on political knowledge surveys, because they're just guessing. And the second is people who are really interested in politics. People for whom this should matter, people who don't want to appear to be caught out by the question, are more likely to come up with an imaginary answer than people who don't care about politics. If you don't care, you just say you don't know. If you care, suddenly you feel you should have a viewpoint.
So obviously you're a seasoned pollster, and writing this book, were there any sections that you came across that you hadn't heard much about, or information that was new to you?
There are two chapters about sexual practices, which I won't go into the details for all sorts of reasons. But what was really interesting about these chapters was that people, voters out there, have a distinct view about the parties when it comes to the sort of sexual practices they think a supporter of the different parties will engage in. You take a step back and think, well, why on earth would that be? But actually, the perceptions of parties, that one party maybe stands up for the poor, one party looks after the rich, actually extend way beyond those sort of perceptions. They go into bedroom practices. And the other thing I thought was fascinating was we also did some questions which asked people about their own sexual practices, and we discovered that actually those differences do exist. We found differences between the preferred sexual practices of Labour voters and Conservative voters and Lib Dem voters and UKIP voters, and are way above those that you would expect to be able to predict based on their age or their background. So actually these differences are out there.
And moving away from the book, obviously we've got this unpredictable general election coming up. How do you think things will go? Do you believe voters will tighten around those main parties the sooner we get close to the next May? And on top of that, do you think the Greens will be able to hold up their 8%, 7% poll rating going into that election?
I think the thing that's interesting about the next election is, firstly, that it's probably the most unpredictable one we've had since the Second World War, if not before. And it's unpredictable not really because the two main parties themselves have lost votes. Their vote share at the moment is roughly what it was in 2010. What's really interesting is what's happened to the other third of the electorate. The last election, most of that other third of the electorate voted Lib Dem. They're now fragmenting all over the place. Some will stick with the Lib Dems, not very many, but enough maybe in the seats the Lib Dems hold. UKIP will get a large chunk of the votes. In Scotland, the SNP could capture 20 to 30 seats, an unprecedented result for them. And the Greens potentially take one or two more seats. So you've got a massive fragmentation of that third of the electorate that don't vote for the other two parties. And what that means, I think, is that it's not just that the next election could result in a hung parliament, which I think a lot of people now expect. It's that it will result in a hung parliament in which the first and the third largest parties themselves are still not enough to form a majority of the House of Commons, at which point they then have to drag in, either into formal coalition or to other agreements, other parties, at which point it gets incredibly messy, incredibly unpredictable, and the chance of the outcome shifting from one outcome to another outcome are almost on the roll of a dice. So it is easily the most unpredictable election we've seen for 40, 50 years.
And my final question is, how do you deal with the almost daily polls that come out? We've got Lord Ashcroft, YouGov, Populars. How much attention do you pay to them, or do you like to sit back and maybe look at monthly trends? And what out of those polls do you find the most important information as well?
We are now the most polled we've ever been in this country. Even before the last election, we didn't have daily opinion polls. We now have at least one opinion poll every day, sometimes more than that if one of the other polling companies apart from YouGov is also reporting a poll. And as the election approaches, we'll get even more. I think there are three obvious things that are worth doing. The first is not to get overexcited about individual polls, and in particular the shifts from one poll to another if they're within the margin of error, which they almost always are. I think people are waking up to that, but it is still very tempting to try to say that if one party's gone up 2 and one party's gone down 2, that is because of a particular event. Almost all of these things don't actually matter. The second thing is to look at some of the underlying poll figures other just than the headline polling figures. So some of the interesting ones are things like, which party do you trust with the economy? Do you think that the economy is improving? And do you think your personal living standards are improving? And these are really quite important polling questions. The third one, in terms of actually judging the next election, is to look at some of the local polls that are coming out, individual seat polls. Because it's not just that we're having more national opinion polls than ever before, we're now also getting more individual constituency polls than ever more. And some of those really are giving you an insight that we never used to have.
And are we seeing in that sense a sort of Americanization, at least on the polling front, of our politics?
I think the biggest trend is not really an Americanization, it's a digitization. It's that we've shifted not universally, but largely to online polling, certainly for national opinion polls. And the beauty of online polling is it's cheaper to do, and therefore it is possible to do daily polls, snap polls, in a way that it wasn't possible to do even 10 years ago. And so that has massively improved the amount of data out there in a way that I don't think it's to do with nationality. I think that is also happening in the States. It's happening in Germany and in France and in Canada and in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, it's just easier to poll now than it used to be because internet penetration is sufficient. I probably would say this because I like opinion polls, but I think it's a good thing. I mean, we know more about the electorate now than we used to. And one of the sort of motivations behind the book really was to try to get across that the electorate doesn't function as a lot of political discourse claims they do. I mean, the number of times you will read in an opinion poll, discussion piece in a newspaper that an event has happened and that this will change the way the electorate think about the parties or the government, and that this has won it for George Osborne or lost it for Nick Clegg. Almost never true. And we know that most of the public don't notice that the way the public react to these things is goes through the prism of partisan affiliation. All of these things, we know that they're more complicated and bluntly interesting people than some of the media coverage.